So my bed is right there, and my desktop setup is right here. And I need this desktop to code, or at least I used to need this desktop to code, because one, it's my only machine running Linux, and I'll get into that in a second. Two, I have everything set up on here. And three, it's just nice. I mean, I have my keyboard with me at all times. It's Lev! So not only am I stuck indoors all day because, well, COVID. I mean, sure, I do walk outside. But because of my bed being right there and my desktop being right here, I'm stuck in my room most days, especially the days that are heavier on coding. And I couldn't take it anymore, just not even being able to move around the house, or like working out of the kitchen, or working on the porch, or working wherever that's not in this room. So I decided to do some investigating, some research. I started looking into how could I possibly take my coding environment with me everywhere. Now, you might ask, why not just like boot Linux onto my laptop? So I have my Dell XPS right here. I love it. Well, first of all, I use Windows on it because I do like to edit photos and like use Lightroom and Photoshop and everything. I like photography. But also, I could dual boot, but I don't really have that much space on here, and I just find it sort of an inconvenience. I have dual booted before, I have used external drives before. I mean, external drives break, or they're expensive, or it's just not really what I like to do. So I decided to start looking into like alternative solutions where I could essentially have my desktop with me everywhere. I first considered just using WSL like I used to on my Dell XPS. WSL being Windows Subsystem Linux, where basically you can run Linux on Windows. But I also didn't really like that because I couldn't really run like some specific rendering things like Flutter, which need to do live rendering on WSL that well, and it's just sort of annoying. In the end, I think I did find a great solution, and that's using an EC2 instance, so a server on Amazon Web Services that I usually SSH into, and I'll get into that later in the video. So I first started by looking into online code editors, like online IDEs, but I had a few prerequisites for them. First, I wanted to be able to run VS Code or something that's like VS Code with Vim key bindings on top, of course. And have all my extensions there ready to go, because I definitely do heavily rely on VS Code extensions and my setup. I know it well, I've used it a lot, I love it. Besides that, I had to have an unrestricted access to like the Linux subsystem and everything. So I've seen some where I would basically be working within Docker containers, which is great if I'm just doing front end, but if I'm doing anything back end where I have to constantly install certain like apt packages or something, it's really inconvenient to have to do that through the Docker image each time. So that would mean that I would have to basically rebuild my workspace every time I want to add a package to my like back-end projects, and I really did not want to have to do that. And then finally, I didn't want to have 20 different separate containers, all with their own SSH keys and their own settings and their own configurations. I just wanted one blanket machine that could store everything for me and run everything for me. That way, my environment setup is just like this one-time upfront requirement. So there were a few online IDEs and code editors that I started looking into. Gitpod being one of them, Visual Studio Codespaces being another one, provided by Microsoft, and Stackblitz being another one. And there's a bunch more out there, but those were really the three that I was looking at as having that more VS Code-y vibe. And I definitely found issues with all three of them. So first off, I spent the most time trying to get Gitpod to run. It's really cool how it linked with GitHub, so it's basically you just click on a button in GitHub and it just says open a Gitpod container with this project. If I was only ever working on GitHub, I would consider using Gitpod, but because I use Bitbucket and AWS code commit a lot, there were some issues associated with that. Like Bitbucket was flat out just not supported yet. So that would just be a big workaround where I'd have to always work with the SSH keys and just for every single project that I do, and I did not want to have to do that. Otherwise, because Gitpod relied so heavily on Docker images for the environment and the whole setup, I found sort of annoyed that I would have to constantly edit and rebuild my environment depending on how my dependencies changed and how what I needed changed. So that didn't really fit my needs. On top of that, it could get expensive. It was around $9 a month for the basic version, which I'm fine with, but there's limited amount of usage there, and then it just sort of adds up. I don't quite remember the numbers, but I will have them on the screen right now. And then otherwise, the whole extension system was sort of a pain. The VS Code extension store was not on there. Really, you had to download VS Code extension files and then drag and drop them onto the website, and it wouldn't always work too well. So I decided to ditch Gitpod and look for another solution. Then I started looking into Visual Studio Codespaces, but I wasn't really there for too long because I saw the price and I was like, nah. So I yeeted out real quick, but it did look like a pretty decent setup considering that Microsoft provides it. So if you're willing to spend the money or it's for your company or something, maybe look into it. I'll have the links in the description below. Finally, Stackblitz looked pretty decent, and it looked great if you're only doing front-end web dev, so Svelte, React, Angular, and it had all these containers built up for that, but again, it didn't really look so great for server-side or any other sort of projects that I would be doing. I do front-end, but not just front-end, so I found I had to move on. Finally, I decided to use AWS, being Amazon Web Services. I've used it before, and I've decided to go the more manual route in having a remote working environment, but it ended up being the best route. So what I did is I'm paying for an EC2 instance. So an EC2 instance just being a virtual machine that I'm running on the cloud. So everything that I'm doing is stored there, everything that I'm doing is running there, and I can access it from anywhere as long as I have permissions to access it. And then what I do is I basically just load everything on there and SSH into that into my EC2 instance. And using something called VS Code Remote Desktop, which is a recently new extension for VS Code, I'm able to SSH into my EC2 instance with ease. But the best part is that all of my VS Code configuration, extensions, environment variables, what have you, can actually be stored on that SSH machine. So when I go from, say, my laptop right here, and I'm like logged in, I get working on here, I install some extensions on VS Code, and then I transition to my desktop, all those extensions and everything that I've done on that VS Code automatically transitions onto my desktop. And in the end, using VS Code's built-in terminal, it does port forwarding for you, so there's like a GUI which can do that for SSHing, and it's built-in extensions. I find that I'm super happy with my developing environment and that I can easily take it anywhere on the go without much hassle or setup. So I have an article linked below on how to set up your EC2 instance and how to start running virtually through EC2. Please let me know what you thought down below. It helps out. And if you're interested, let me know. Check out my blog. I think I'll have like bullet points on this linked below. Sweet. Peace out, guys.